Well, Canada had two big moments this week. One leader refused to reflect on anything, and the other dropped $56 billion worth of nation-building projects. And guess which one complained about the media?
So Polliev loses 2 MPs in a week. He gets asked if he's reflected on his leadership style and delivers the most honest one-word press conference in Canadian history.
Yeah, a reporter asked, "Have you reflected on your leadership style moving forward?" And Polliev says, "No. Period. End of sentence. End of growth."
Every word of that answer drips with insecurity. It's like he heard, "Hey, this looks bad. Are you going to adjust?" and replied, "Absolutely not. I will be exactly the same forever."
Meanwhile, Mark Carney's out in Terrence, BC, dropping a $56 billion list of national projects. LNG, critical minerals, hydroferroalkyl, a North Coast transmission line, and an Arctic corridor. He basically rolled out the adult version of a Lego megaset and said, "Here, let's build a country."
So here's the question. If Polliev won't change, why should Canada stick around?
Let's start with Pierre's very bad week. His budget week, by the way. This is usually when the leader of the opposition gets to pound away at the government day after day.
Instead of doing budget breakdowns, he was stuck explaining why his own people were running for the exit.
First, Chris d'Entremont, longtime Nova Scotia Conservative, crosses the floor to join Carney's Liberals, and he doesn't leave quietly. He says it felt like a frat house instead of a serious political party, which is a brutal thing to say about a caucus led by a guy who constantly lectures the country about being serious and adult and responsible.
Then a couple of days later, Alberta MP Matt Gerenou just packs it in and quits politics entirely. No crossing the floor, no starting some noble independent crusade, just, you know what? I'm out.
At that point, you could practically hear the Ottawa pundit class cracking their knuckles. Whoa, is this it? Is Polliev finished? Is there going to be a leadership revolt?
And don't forget Andrew Scheer. He tried to spin the whole thing as some kind of liberal backroom pressure campaign. As if Chris d'Entremont woke up one morning and said, "You know what would be fun? Setting my entire political life on fire because Mark Carney whispered in a hallway."
Of course the Liberals are talking to frustrated Conservatives. When a Conservative MP looks fed up, they're going to see if he wants a new home, right? Anyone pretending that that's shocking has never watched Parliament for more than 10 minutes.
So Polliev finally steps in front of the camera with a couple of MPs lined up as wallpaper behind him.
Every MP behind him took turns praising him like they were auditioning for Employee of the Month. Not a single hint of self-reflection. No acknowledgement that his own caucus is leaking stories about frustration and burnout. Reports say as many as 10 to 15 Conservatives are fed up with his leadership, and he's pretending that the room is calm.
So here's the scene. A reporter asks the obvious question, "Have you reflected on your leadership style?" Polliev says, "No." Any normal leader would at least pretend to reflect. You know the line, "I'll always listen to my caucus. We're a team. I take every concern seriously." Polliev, he didn't even bother. He just did a hard no.
That answer tells you everything where his head is at. He's not just doubling down, he's welded to the floor. And once again, he offered nothing. No plan, no policy, not even a basic outline of what he'd do differently. Just another round of pointing at problems without saying how he'd fix any of them.
And the moment reporters pressed him, he went after the media. He attacked questions, attacked coverage, and accused Canadian journalists of being out to get him. They asked about his own mess, and suddenly the entire industry is corrupt. Sound familiar?
Which is wild, because on the Liberal side, you have Nate Erskine-Smith criticizing parts of the Liberal budget, but he's still staying supportive. That's what an actual party conversation looks like. People disagreeing without collapsing into a crisis.
Poilievre's whole strategy is volume over substance. Deny, deflect, blame the press, and pretend caucus discipline is perfect while half your backbenchers look like they're planning for the escape route.
He's saying that he wants shovels in the ground, but the only hole getting deeper is the one that he's digging under himself.
And while all of this is unfolding, there was a moment that really says something about where the Conservative movement has drifted. Chris d'Entremont, the MP who crossed the floor, he showed up to lay a wreath on Remembrance Day, a quiet, respectful moment. And people booed him. In Canada, you don't do that. Whatever your opinion of the guy, Remembrance Day is not a place for heckling. It's supposed to be the one day where everyone steps back and shows respect.
Look, you can disagree with what he did politically, fine, but booing someone at a Remembrance Day ceremony, that's losing your grip on what it means to be Canadian.
And in the background, you've got pollsters saying the same thing. His own base still loves him. Inside conservative circles, he's basically the brand. Among conservative voters, his approval is sky high. In head-to-heads against Carney, other conservatives test worse than he does, including Stephen Harper.
And here's the part conservatives don't want you to talk about. Yes, his base loves him, but the rest of the country doesn't. National polling has him trailing Mark Carney by nearly 20 points. He's the favorite inside his own party, not across Canada. Those are two very different realities.
So he's not about to be dragged out of Stornoway by the party elders. That leadership review in January, unless the membership suddenly grows a conscience and a calculator at the same time, he'll survive it.
But that's exactly the point. His job is safe. Canada's patience is not.
With Polliev, you've got a leader who is polarizing, dug in, and convinced that the only problem is the media and elites and everyone else but him.
And meanwhile, Carney is in Terrence, BC, announcing real projects for all Canadians, not press conference theater. Mines, transmission lines, Northern Hydro, critical minerals, 5 major builds aimed at giving the world a non-China option for batteries and advanced manufacturing.
Plus, his government is cutting some mine permitting times for 6 years to 2. That alone changes the investment landscape overnight. And Canada already has lower federal corporate tax rates than the US, which he's trying to leverage to pull more long-term investment north of the border.
Listen, these projects aren't instant. They take time. They unfold over years, not news cycles. The risk for Carney is obvious. Will Canadians have the patience? Will people understand long-term strategy, or will they ask, where's the result, before anything has even had any time to get built?
But the overall direction is clear. He's not shouting into the cameras. He's working with provinces, with Indigenous partners, and yes, even Doug Ford on the Ring of Fire. It's steady, slow, and serious. And the contrast with Polliev could not be more obvious.
And speaking of big projects, let's talk about the one detail that exploded the group chats this week. So, everyone's asking the same question right now. If this LNG project is supposed to be part of Canada's big nation-building moment, why on earth is Texas holding part of the rent?
Yeah, and it's an obvious question. You've got Carney standing up there talking about sovereignty and independence, and meanwhile, one of the main partners is a company backed by American investors, including people who've donated to Trump. It's a bit like saying, we're taking control of our destiny, just let me grab these American checks really quick.
But here's the thing that nobody ever says. Carney didn't get to pick his dream team. He didn't open a catalog and say, yes, I'll take one Indigenous-led LNG project powered by hydro with a Scandinavian investor on the side.
Here's the deal. This project already existed. The Nisga'a Nation spent years putting it together. It was underway. The partners were chosen, the capital was already in the room.
And for anyone wondering about the ownership mix, Western LNG out of Texas isn't the whole project, but its subsidiaries will own and operate the actual facility. That's why people keep calling it Texas back, even though the Nisga'a and Canadian consortium are full partners.
So the question for Ottawa wasn't, which country do we want to partner with? It was, do we support this project with the partners it already has? Or do we walk away and pretend a flawless 100% Canadian alternative is about to fall from the sky?
Guess what? It's not. Canada doesn't have a deep bench of companies that build floating LNG terminals the size of aircraft carriers. What we do have is decades of debating pipelines until investors leave.
And that's why Texas gets a seat at the table, because frankly, they stayed. They had the money, the technical teams, the risk tolerance, and the experience. Canadian companies, well, most of them wouldn't touch a mega project like this without years of government guarantees. And even then, they probably would back out halfway through.
And meanwhile, the Nisga'a Nation wasn't waiting around for the perfect geopolitical arrangement. They said, we want equity, we want ownership, we want long-term revenue, and we want a seat in the room where decisions get made. If that means partnering with a US firm, then so be it. Because for once, an indigenous nation isn't the one being sidelined. But, and here's the wrinkle, it does raise the question. If Canada keeps leaning on foreign capital for these big projects, how much sovereignty are we actually gaining?
Because imagine telling Canadians, we're standing up to Donald Trump's threats to Canada and then quietly partnering with his donor network on the side. It's not exactly a great look.
But it's the reality of how mega projects get built in this country right now. For 20 years, Canada scared off half of the world's investors with delays, protests, court fights, and political U-turns. So by the time Carney stepped in, the players who still had the appetite to work were Americans, not Norwegians, not Japanese, not the big Gulf funds.
And even if he had shopped around internationally, those guys don't show up without wanting full control, privileged access, and a guaranteed market. The Nisga's would have lost ownership in a heartbeat.
So Carney had two choices. Work with the existing partners, warts and all, or let the project die and go back to explaining why Canada, a G7 country with the world's cleanest electricity grid, still can't build a single major northern export facility.
You can see why he swallowed the awkward parts. Because at least this version gives Indigenous communities equity and leverage. This project is also expected to create 20,000 plus jobs while still adhering to environmental regulations. The alternative is just another decade of red tape.
So yes, it's messy. It's not a clean nationalism moment. It's not oil-painted patriotism. It's a Canadian mega project, which means it's part opportunity, part contradiction, and part paperwork avalanche.
And here's the bigger picture. Carney is actually out there cutting deals with Indigenous nations, with provinces, even with American capital, because that's how Canada has always advanced big national projects. It's never tidy, but we know how to work with the US without getting swallowed by it.
Canada's trying to build. Texas was already there with the money. And we're left sorting out whether that's practical, embarrassing, or just the way big projects work in 2025.
This is what we mean when we say Canada moves on. Not in some grand dramatic way, just slowly through 100 decisions like this. It's not just about tankers and pipe, it's also about who owns the mine, whose grid we use, whether a Iqaluit runs on diesel or hydro, and whether our nickel ends up in Canadian factories or Russian drones.
The Major Projects Office is risky, right? It can be abused. It could easily become a rubber stamp if the wrong people are in charge. But it's also one of the first times in a long time that Ottawa has said out loud, we're picking some priorities and moving them faster.
And in that context, Pierre's "no, I'm not reflecting" answer feels exactly as small as it sounded.
Most Canadians are not sitting at home obsessing over floor crossings. They're wondering if their kids will afford a home, whether their jobs are secure, and who's actually doing something about Arctic security while Russia and China poke around our backyard.
That's why this week is such a turning point. Because on one side, you have a conservative leader who is still essentially running a permanent campaign like it's 2020. Daily outrage, short clips, picking fights with reporters, it goes on and on.
And on the other side, you have a government that, for all its flaws, is making the case. We're going to build transmission lines, mines, and hydro so Canada isn't held hostage by foreign regimes or American elections for the next 40 years.
You don't have to love every project. We certainly don't.
But at least we're arguing about the actual shape of the country, not whether Pierre's feelings got hurt by a floor crosser.
So where does that leave PP anyway? Well, let's be blunt. He's not going anywhere. His supporters, they're still solid. The polling still shows he's the strongest conservative option against Carney, and his base, his bros, they don't see a frat house. They see a fighter who says exactly what he has always said.
But politics isn't just about your base. It's about the people who are half watching from the kitchen while they cook dinner. Those people saw two stories this week. One, a conservative leader snapping no when asked if he'll reflect. and 2, a prime minister standing beside Indigenous leaders, miners, and northern communities talking about jobs, grids, and Arctic projects.
So if you fast forward a few years and ask, who's weak aged better? The guy insisting he's perfect and everyone else is wrong?
Or the guy who will be able to say, we powered Iqaluit with hydro. We built a transmission line to Prince Rupert. We opened a nickel mine that feeds into Canadian manufacturing instead of Russian weapon systems.
So here's our take. Is Pierre Poilievre finished? I don't think so. But is his act starting to look very small next to the scale of choices Canada is making right now? Absolutely.
One man is stuck in a loop and the other is rearranging half the map.
And if you want a country that actually builds things instead of just yelling, give this video a like and drop a comment. What do you think about these projects? Are you more worried about the climate side, or are you excited about the LNG and jobs, or both?
And if you want more deep dives on how all this ties into Canada's future, check out the A-Team, our Substack, and make sure you're subscribed. Hit that notification bell and check out the other videos on our channel.
We'll keep following the projects, we'll keep following the polls, but most importantly, we're going to keep calling it like we see it.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and see you next time.